Well, I made it into camp and want to share this story with you here. This is an old story from back early 1900s about an event that would have happened in the late 1800s. And this story is told by J.W. Burns, and he was a government Indian agent / teacher in the Chehalis Indian Reserve in British Columbia. Okay, and this is about a young lady named Seraphine Long who was reportedly abducted by a Sasquatch back then. So that being said, let's read a little about this, and after I read this, I'm going to share some of my thoughts on this. And he says, perhaps the strangest and most terrifying experience that any Indian has had with the Sasquatch is that related by an Indian woman named Seraphine Long. Now very old, Seraphine claims that many years ago, when she was a young girl, she was kidnapped by a wild giant and lived in the haunts of the hairy monsters of the mountains for close on a year. She has told me the story many times, and I have it set down as nearly as possible in her own words. So what happened to Seraphine Long? Before doing so, however, I should explain that among the natives of Canada, both Indians and Eskimos, there is a shortage of marriageable girls. Probably a similar condition exists among the Sasquatch, thus explaining the action of the wild giant in this case. I should also like to add that although her present-day photograph hardly bears this out, the evidence of her contemporaries goes to show that in her girlhood, Seraphine Long was considered one of the most comely girls in her tribe. Here is the story. And she says, I was walking home one day many years ago, carrying a big bundle of cedar roots and thinking of the young brave Qualac that I was soon to marry. Suddenly, at a place where the bush grew close and thick beside the trail, a long arm shot out and a big hairy hand was pressed over my mouth. Then I was suddenly lifted up into the arms of a young Sasquatch. I was terrified. I fought and struggled with all my might. In those days, I was very strong. But it was no good. The wild man was as powerful as a young bear. Holding me easily under one arm, with his other hand he smeared tree gum over my eyes, sticking them shut so that I could not see where he was taking me. He then lifted me to his shoulder and started to run. He ran on and on for a long time, up and down hills, through thick brush, across many streams, never stopping to rest. Once he had to swim a river, and then perhaps I could have gotten away, but I was so afraid of being drowned that I held on tightly with my arms about his neck. Although I was frightened, I could not but admire his easy breathing, his great strength and speed of foot. After reaching the other side of the river, he began to climb and climb. Presently the air became very cold. I could not see, but I guessed that we were close to the top of the mountain. At last the Sasquatch stopped hurrying. Then he stooped over and moved slowly as if feeling his way along a tunnel. Presently, he laid me down very gently, and I heard people talking in a strange tongue. I could not understand this tongue. The young giant next wiped the sticky tree gum from my eyelids, and I was able to look around me. I sat up and saw that I was in a great big cave. The floor was covered with animal skins, soft to touch and better preserved than we preserve them. A small fire in the middle of the floor gave all the light that there was. As my eyes became accustomed to the gloom, I saw that beside the young giant who had brought me to the cave, there were two other wild people, a man and a woman. To me, a young girl, they seemed very, very old, but they were active and friendly, and later I learned that they were the parents of the young Sasquatch who had stolen me. When they all came over to look at me, I cried and asked them to let me go. They just smiled and shook their heads. From then on, I was kept a close prisoner. Not once would they let me go out of the cave. Always one of them stayed with me, when the other two were away. They fed me well on roots, fish, and meat. After I had learned a few words of their tongue, which is not unlike the Douglas dialect, I asked the young giant how he caught and killed the deer, mountain goats, and sheep that he often brought into the cave. He smiled, opening and closing his big hairy hands. I guessed that he just laid in wait when an animal got close enough. He leaped, caught it, and choked it to death. He was certainly big enough, quick enough, and strong enough to do so. When I had been in the cave for about a year, I began to feel very sick and weak and could not eat much. I told this to the young Sasquatch and pleaded with him to take me back to my own people. At first he got very angry, as did his father and mother, but I kept on pleading with them, telling them that I wished to see my own people again before I died. I really was ill, and I suppose they could see that for themselves, because one day after I cried for a long time, the young Sasquatch went outside and returned with a leaf full of tree gum. With this, he stuck down my eyelids as he had done before. Then he again lifted me to his big shoulder. The return journey was like a very bad dream, for I was lightheaded and in much pain. When we recrossed the wide river, I was almost swept away. I was too weak to cling to the young Sasquatch, but he held me with one big hand and swam with the other. Close to my home, he put me down and gently removed the tree gum from my eyelids. When he saw that I could see again, he shook his head sadly, pointed to my house, and then returned back into the forest. My people were all wildly excited when I stumbled back into the house, for they had long ago given me up as dead. But I was too sick and weak to talk. I just managed to crawl into bed, and that night I gave birth to a child. The little one lived only a few hours, for which I have always been thankful. I hope that never again shall I see a Sasquatch. And that is Seraphine Long's story, the only one on record, at that time anyway, of a Sasquatch ever abducting an Indian girl. I could relate more instances concerning the wild giants of British Columbia, seemingly well-attested cases that I have collected over a period of many years, but in this article, the few I have recounted must suffice. And he goes on to ask the question, is it possible that primitive, hairy giants still inhabit the mountain solitudes of British Columbia? And goes on to say that he, like the tribal people there, he also believes. So that is a very interesting story. And I'll tell you, if that is a true story, a true account of an actual happening, that tells us some things about the nature of the Sasquatch that are very interesting and can help us understand more about them. And I wrote down a few thoughts of my own about this. Things that we learn from this account. And by the way, the mosquitoes are starting to get out. My fire's died down and the smoke's not very thick, so mosquitoes have decided I'm on the menu. But anyway, here are my thoughts on this account. Things that we learn from this account, if it's true, and I put the emphasis on if this is true. And one is, and this is very interesting, they had a language, and it was similar enough to the Douglas dialect that Seraphine was able to learn a few words of their tongue, and enough to plead with them to let her go home, and such as that. So, again, if this story is true, the Sasquatch, they have a language, and it's very similar to a known dialect. And two, they lived in a cave in a family unit. And three, and this goes even more interesting there, they preserved animal skins in a way that Seraphine says was superior to her people, in which they used to cover the floor of the cave, like having to make it nice and soft to walk on. And four, and this here, even more interesting, they had the ability to make fire and did make fire, as Seraphine noticed when she was first brought into the into the cave. She doesn't say what they did with it. She said it just provided light. Did they cook with it or not? Well, we don't know that, but they did have the ability to make fire. And 5, and this tells us even more about what the Sasquatch may just be and what they would not be, is this young giant, this Sasquatch, impregnated Seraphine. Now, if this account is true, I say if, then the Sasquatch are not just animals. They're not just simply some undiscovered ape like a Gigantopithecus that for some reason left its home in Southeast Asia and went all the way across the Bering ice bridge just to set up camp over here and become what we call Bigfoot today. This would not be the case if this account is true, especially if they can produce children with us modern humans. Even if this child died shortly after it was born, as Seraphine said, it may not be because it was incompatible with us. It could be just that the stress that she was under caused her to miscarry. So anyway, she carried it to term, gave birth to a baby that died. Now, if they can do that, they would have to be very, very closely related to us. And living in a cave that they furnished with prepared animal hides and lit it with the fire, that's not something an ape does. Those are very human traits. Matter of fact, they call them the Sasquatch people. So what I want to know now is, what are your opinions about this story? Is it just a made-up story by Seraphine, as I've heard some people say that maybe she ran off with the boyfriend that her parents didn't approve of and got pregnant and was abandoned by him or so? Would it be that? Or is it in fact a true story, as Seraphine told it, which tells us a lot about what both the Sasquatch are and what they are not? Okay, there are similarities to this story also with the story of the abduction of Albert Ostman, where he was carried in his sleeping bag up to a box canyon high in the British Columbia mountains. And I'll share that story at a later date and share my thoughts on it. But anyway, back to this one. Is this in fact a true story? I want to know what you think. Or is it, and it could possibly be, just a story? You know, I don't know. But I want to know what you think. But regardless, it is a very, very interesting story, and I would like to know your comments on it. If you like this story and would like to hear more like it, hit that subscribe button so you'll get notifications. I'm just going to leave it at that. Share your thoughts with me. Stay tuned for more to come. And until next time, I'm going to build my fire back up and fix myself some supper. And you guys take care.